to What One Thing podcast. I am JT Long. I am Vice President and Content Director here at Smart Meetings, and I am so excited to be sitting here with Geoff Freeman from U.S. Travel, and we're going to talk about why it is so important that we demand the tools we need in order to put on the international conferences that move economies, that move science and medicine forward, and bring people together. Thank you so much for being here, Geoff.
Thank you for the invitation.
We're going to have a little bit of a conversation about what would help planners bring attendees to the United States for international conferences. What is limiting them right now? Why didn't the industry come back as quickly as we all thought it was going to?
Yeah, the number one thing that would help us is partnership, and that partnership needs to happen with the federal government. When we look at what's happened with international inbound travel post-pandemic, it tells a really disappointing story. The United States remains the world's most desired nation to visit, but we're losing market share. Travelers are choosing to go elsewhere. Pre-pandemic, we welcomed 79 million international visitors. Last year, we welcomed 67 million. So we're only 84% of where we were before the pandemic. Why are travelers going elsewhere? They're going elsewhere because other nations are recognizing, embracing that this is a competition for the business of these travelers, and they're making their destinations more appealing, largely by focusing on the processes of getting into those countries. A lot of countries are waiving visa requirements. They're moving to new technologies, ambitious goals for processing visas. They're working on their customs checkpoint and getting people through that checkpoint more quickly than they did in the past. All while the U.S., at least at a federal level, has taken a much more passive approach, has, I think, in large part failed to recognize the role the government plays in ensuring the success of meetings, conventions, the travel industry writ large in the United States. We can go into it more deeply, but our government has allowed obstacles to form that are encouraging travelers to take their business elsewhere.
And it's not a matter of people not wanting to come. The demand is there from what I'm understanding. What can be done? Let's just start with the visa issue, where it can take over a year to get someone a visa. What can be done to balance both security and access?
Yeah, the demand, as you said, is absolutely there. The U.S. remains, as I mentioned before, the world's most desired nation to visit. That's not to say we don't have problems. We have cost issues. We have issues relative to the strength of the dollar and the weakness of some other currencies. Increasingly, travelers mention concerns about public safety when considering trips to the United States. So it's not to say that we don't have issues. We do. But when you look at what's discouraging travelers from coming, and when you really talk to these travelers, you learn that it's various government processes in most instances. You mentioned visas. That's a huge one. Visas are absolutely enormous when it comes to processing these travelers. We see wait times in countries right now to get an interview for a visa that exceeds 600, 700, 800 days just to meet with a U.S. consulate to get that interview. That's a huge problem because 45% of all travelers that come into the United States are required to get a visa. And if we can't process them in 4, 5, 6, 800 days, well, common sense says they're going to go elsewhere. So this is an obvious situation to address. It's one that the Biden administration is increasingly acknowledging. We were with the White House last week talking about these various issues, heard all of the right things, but we need to set a 38-day goal. We need to stop talking about it. We need to start doing it to get travelers into the country much more efficiently.
And my understanding from talking to planners who put on international events is that the hardest thing is getting young people in, getting that next generation of attendee in, because maybe they don't already have a visa. So what does this mean for the future if it's really hard to get young people in?
Well, and that's true, not just for conventions. If we turn away travelers, let me take a step back. The world is just more competitive today. There are markets that people travel to today, whether it's for business or pleasure, that they didn't travel to 10, 15, 20 years ago. And if at that younger age, they're becoming obsessed with some of these new markets, it makes it that much harder for us to capture these travelers later in life. We're seeing that. We're seeing travelers that are finding experiences elsewhere that give them the fulfillment they need. They don't feel a need to come to the United States. And when they don't come to the United States, that means they don't go home and tell their friends and family about how wonderful their trip was. It means they don't have a better impression of what this country is all about. It means they're perhaps less likely to align with us in the future. It is a huge issue that at a federal level, we have long taken for granted. I have this conversation daily with colleagues, with people across other industries. Travel is seen as something that just happens. I was in Niagara Falls last week at a meeting, though, and I heard a comment that really stuck with me, and it was that travel happens by design, not by default. And I think that increasingly our challenge is that governments think it happens by default. They fail to recognize that they are a critical, or must be a critical partner in addressing the system. And that's U.S. travel's responsibility. It's the responsibility of all of us who work in this industry to knock these people upside the head and wake them up to why they need to be much more engaged on travel issues.
And you talked about the competition. I'm hearing that Saudi Arabia is spending so much money to bring people, and it's working in many cases.
It's interesting about Saudi Arabia, which is spending upwards of $1 trillion to invest in its travel economy. What I often hear from people when I tell them that is they say back, well, I'm not going to go to Saudi Arabia. And I say, you're missing the point. It's not about you going to Saudi Arabia. It's for the person that we were trying to bring into the United States who has chosen that, you know what? Saudi can provide me with a different, a better, or more welcoming experience. That's who we've lost. And in Europe, in Asia, Saudi Arabia is increasingly attractive, but they're not the only ones. I mean, let's look closer to home. The United Kingdom is looking at ways, it's eliminating its requirement to take off your shoes and get rid of your liquids when going through the security checkpoint. They're looking at ways of moving away from the visa altogether and moving to facial recognition. Canada has recognized our weaknesses with processing visas, and they've recently added 14 countries to travel visa-free into Canada, all of whom needed visas to get in the United States. So they looked at our weakness and they said, how do we pounce on this? How do we capture a traveler that might have gone to the U.S., but now we can bring them in more easily into Canada? Other countries are awake. Saudi is the most kind of potent example of that with these massive investments, but other countries are aware of the importance of competing. And it's something that, again, we've got to make sure that policymakers, opinion leaders realize here. We've got our work cut out for us. It is what it is when it comes to our industry. And that's why we need the partnership from across the industry. We need everybody to realize that they're a lobbyist. They're an advocate. They're a zealot for what this industry is all about. That's how we're finally going to make some progress.
Well, and even when they have their visa and they know they want to come to the United States, there have been some challenges with flights. So particularly from China, not because, again, of lack of demand, but we have not allowed as many flights in. And from what I heard, that is having a ripple effect. So people from China go to Australia and Japan, and then that raises the price of those flights, and people from Australia and Japan can't afford to come here. How do we fix that?
Yeah, it's a big issue. And just putting China and Japan in perspective, at the end of 23, we only welcomed about 40% of the number of Chinese and Japanese travelers that we welcomed pre-pandemic. So we've seen a massive fall off in these travelers. They're important because they spend more than other overseas visitors. They stay longer. They contribute to the United States in different ways. We need these Asian travelers back. And there's a variety of reasons why it's not happening. We have to acknowledge the Japanese yen is quite weak. China was slow to come out of the pandemic. But there are also other things that are happening that are a little bit more within our control. Pre-pandemic, we had 150 weekly nonstop flights between the United States and China. Right now, we have 50. So we have 1/3 of the number of flights we had pre-pandemic. Now, there's a variety of complications with that, one of which is that because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it is no longer safe to fly over Russian airspace. So U.S. airlines and foreign airlines are required to oblige by this as well. Not flying over Russian airspace substantially increases the amount of time one spends and increases the cost. So the cost of flights from Asia to the United States are higher than they once were. We're working with our partners, particularly at United and Delta, to address issues of capacity. I think it is going to be a challenge so long as this war continues. The simple truth is that the end of that war, when it comes to travel, is absolutely critical. The end of that war, for a variety of reasons, is absolutely critical. But it's really important to those Russia overflight issues. I think then we also have to address other issues that would make us more attractive, particularly to Chinese travelers. The visa issue is increasing there. We have millions of Chinese travelers whose 10-year visa expires within the next year or two. So we're going to have to process these travelers more quickly. China is one of the countries that increasingly talks about public safety. So we have issues there that we have to address and make people feel confident in their own security and safety. So there are issues that we can address. What I'm excited about, and I'm sorry to be long-winded, what I'm excited about is our major trade show, IPW, is set to welcome more Chinese and Japanese buyers than we've seen at any point the past 6 years or so. So even pre-pandemic, we've got great numbers in Los Angeles of these Chinese and Japanese buyers. We're excited about that and hopeful that that's beginning to unlock those markets.
Nice. And didn't I hear that there has been more money allocated for processing and hiring people?
Yeah, when it comes to the visa side of things, there are additional resources being made available. We have seen the State Department make some good strides in certain markets. Brazil, for example, was a market where wait times a year ago may have been over 500 days. They're down to under 100 days in many instances right now. That's a positive sign. It's due because they extended consulate hours, they rushed some extra officials in. But let's just be clear, 100 days still keeps us last in the world in terms of visa processing. So it's good that we've made progress, but we need a 30-day goal to process all of these visitors who want to come here. If you were running a business, you're running an ice cream store, and you tell people to come back in 100 days to get their ice cream, you're going to go out of business pretty quickly. And we need to look at this in the terms of the customer. What is it that fits their needs? You know, we've got the 2026 World Cup coming up now in just a little over 2 years. If you're in Colombia, Mexico, a handful of other markets, and you haven't already applied for your visa, you're not coming to the World Cup, which is just shameful. It's shameful on our part that people want to come to the United States, spend their money, and leave with a better impression, and we're making it too difficult for them to do that.
The other thing I'm hearing is that it used to be considered a gateway city problem, right? People, particularly coming to the West Coast, to Seattle, to San Francisco, to LA from Asia. But the secondary cities are seeing a lot of traffic from people that come, do extended visits, and this is impacting all over the country.
I was in Atlanta earlier this week. Our nation's busiest airport. Was with airport officials down there. And my number might be slightly off, but not by much. I believe they said of their international travelers, more than 60% are connecting onto another market. So this is much more than a gateway issue. These travelers, particularly travelers that have been here before, we know that travelers, when they come the first time, we know what some of their most prominent places to visit are. But it's that second, third, fourth trip and beyond where they're really getting outside into other areas of the country. I mentioned earlier I was in Niagara Falls last week. It was amazing to see the Asian, Indian, other foreign travelers that were up there, in April in upper, New York State. That's a courageous time to get up there, right? But they're there. You see the demand in national parks and elsewhere. This issue of international travelers is absolutely critical. It's one I frequently hear from trade show organizers. I remember having this conversation regarding the Consumer Electronics Show. Upwards of 10 to 20% of the attendees that they want can't get into the country to get there. And that continues across other shows. It's something that we've got to address. It's not just a leisure problem. It's not just a convention problem. It's across the board, and it's hitting every destination in the country.
And you mentioned before the increases in using technology for this. Can you talk about how you can marry both security and efficiency? This is not an either or.
You couldn't say it any better than that. And I'm so pleased to know that increasingly our government partners are saying that as well. I mentioned being in Atlanta. I was there with TSA, with Customs and Border Protection, with other officials, where that same point was made. We can have the world's best security and the world's most efficient system. I got to witness earlier this week a new kind of TSA checkpoint of the future, where if you have your passport number in your Delta SkyMiles account, there's a separate line that you just walk through, takes a picture of you, connects it with your passport photo instantly. In less than 6 seconds, you're through the TSA checkpoint. That's the opportunity we have in front of us if we're using biometrics, particularly facial technology, which a majority of travelers are happy to hand over in exchange for a better security experience. There's great opportunity. Where that opportunity is really important is not just like with visas and TSA checkpoints. It's important with customs. And here's why. Increasingly, travelers have to wait 2, 3, or more hours to get through the customs checkpoint. So here you've been on a flight for 12 hours to come to the United States, and our welcome gift to you is a long line to stand in. If you're anything like me, it's probably a long line to stand in a place that's just 2 degrees too hot. You're already uncomfortable. You haven't slept. You feel crappy. And that's the experience that we give to travelers. A big challenge there is that we don't have enough customs officers in the airports. And we're probably not going to have enough customs officers in the airports anytime soon because of the crisis at the southern border. Because of the crisis at the southern border, we're sending more and more officers in that direction, which leaves the airports understaffed. The solution is technology. The solution is creating a global entry-like experience for as many of those travelers as possible. How do we get more Americans enrolled in global entry? How do we get more of our foreign partners where we have some of these trusted security relationships enrolled in global entry, mobile passport, other technologies, so that fewer and fewer visitors or returnees are even interacting with a customs and border protection official? That's where technology can play such an important role. And I'm pleased that the conversations with TSA, with CBP, they're trending in the right direction. One of those agencies is a little bit more aggressive than the other in embracing technology and new approaches. But across the board, we're hearing more and more of the right words, and we at U.S. Travel will certainly keep the pressure on them to make sure they deliver on that.
One of the things we talk about all the time is that anything that happens in the world impacts a meeting planner. So whether it's a war in the Ukraine, it's crisis on the southern border, we all have to deal with it. And yet, with the big impact that we have economically, we don't speak as one voice, except for what you do on our behalf, to demand what we need to get the people here that we need here. So this is what is one thing meeting professionals can do to be their own advocates and to use the power, the economic power and the influence that they should rightly have.
So I'm going to get to your one thing, but let me start by saying we at U.S. Travel need to do a better job. We need to do a better job of being a resource to the industry, to share their messages, to organize the industry. We do some great things, but we can do better. And I think the meeting and event space is an example of that, where there's multiple different groups. There's some splinter groups on conventions. How do we get everybody around and singing from the same song sheet? That's really, really important. It's an area where U.S. Travel has to focus. I think there's one thing, and I mentioned it earlier in passing, if there's one thing that everybody in the industry needs to realize is that it's not enough to just be a meeting planner. It's not enough to just be a director of marketing. It's not enough to perform the job responsibilities that you were handed on day one, because nowhere on there does it say that you're also a lobbyist. And that's what we need everyone in this industry to realize. I think you've probably heard me, JT, say it before. There are certain industries in this country that we just bestow upon them a degree of significance that is greater than other industries. I've seen it firsthand in my own career. Anything with the word manufacturing, we deem to be more important, more significant, more critical. And we bend over backwards to help manufacturing. I mean, look at the tax breaks we throw at manufacturers. Look at the way we talk about manufacturers. We do everything we can for manufacturing. The travel industry, the meetings industry, the events industry, it doesn't come with that same benefit. We don't get the same benefit of the doubt and assumption that we provide great value. So we have to work harder. We have to recognize that being a lobbyist is important. That doesn't mean everyone needs to fly to Washington every third week to be a lobbyist. Every one of us can be a lobbyist in our own community. We can be a lobbyist with our friends. We can be a lobbyist with the local media, with local elected officials, with our own family. So many people in this industry joke, my family doesn't understand what I do. Well, you know what? If your family doesn't understand what you do, no one else is going to understand it. And it's time to stop joking about it and fix it, right? We need people to understand what we do and why we're important. So how do we become lobbyists at all levels to make sure that people recognize the economic impact, the social impact, the community impact of what this industry does? And I'll close with this. A group that helped me see it best, I was talking with some folks at the American Dental Association, and they were talking about why some of these international issues were so problematic to them because of their trade show and the visitors they weren't able to get here. Nobody would ever connect travel issues with dentistry. But they did. They made the connection. Policymakers don't realize when that convention center is sold out in town every week, that's the travel industry at work. When those pharmaceutical companies are meeting, that's the travel industry at work. We can be a lobbyist by making that connection. Whatever is happening in your city this week, this night, whatever is happening at that concert venue where 30% of those people are staying in hotels, that's the travel industry at work. And it's our responsibility to share that story.
Absolutely. Well, we will definitely be sure to share that story in the pages of Smart Meetings. And thank you for being our guest on this special podcast, and have a wonderful IPW.
Thank you. I enjoyed it. Look forward to seeing you soon.
Smart Meetings, What One Thing was produced by Bright Business Media. Visit smartmeetings.com to subscribe to your daily dose of inspiration.